This is a painting by the Baroque master Diego Velåzquez. It is titled An Old Woman Cooking Eggs. And you'll notice that in addition to the old woman and this boy, there are a number of still life objects. The woman is holding a spoon in one hand and an egg in another. The boy is holding a melon in one hand and a glass container in the other. There are these objects in the lower right, a dish, a knife, a mortar and pestle. You have the eggs being cooked and so on. The relations between recognizable figures and objects create meaning. They create a scene, a situation. One might describe this scene as ordinary or domestic, but the Baroque style of dark shadows and sharp contrast between forms makes this ordinary scene a dramatic one. The reason why I'm discussing this particular painting is because it is an excellent example of how painters think and see abstractly, and how this relates to perception. When we ignore recognizable objects and figures to only focus on the lines, colors, and values, the composition becomes more like a constellation of floating bodies. There is a kinetic swirl in the scene. There's something cosmic about this composition. It's like looking at a solar system. These are the kinds of associations we make when we see abstractly. Your eye gets stirred around the composition like the egg in the pan, and it centers our focus on the action involved, the verb of the painting. Everything gravitates and converges on this focal point of the hands. All of these forms seem animated towards this point. Velázquez is creating a parallel between his hand and the old woman's hand. You get a sense that the old woman is multitasking. She is engaged in a kind of juggling act. So the abstract composition brings the motion and life to the scene. And this dynamic does not depend on the viewer recognizing the objects that are depicted. This dynamic is constructed abstractly. A similar composition without recognizable figures or objects would still animate one's attention across the surface of the canvas. Purely abstract paintings demonstrate how this occurs. Consider this work by Kandinsky as an example. It has a similar dynamism. Velázquez is a master at both composing abstractly as well as representing figurative content realistically. This effect of realism is mostly due to a coherence of light. The objects and figures are unified under the same light. Velázquez was fascinated with odd-looking people. He loved to combine his incredible draftsmanship with the idiosyncrasies of an imperfect human body. When we analyze the painting in purely abstract terms, we notice lines, shapes, colors, and values. And if we look at any one particular line, we see that it also has a shape. It has a color and has a value. When we look at any shape, we can find values and colors and implied lines and so on. So the visual artist is trained to see both abstractly and figuratively. If an artist is to simulate a subject in space, then he or she must translate the subject into abstract elements that take form in two dimensions. To break down perception into the formal elements of image making is to see the undifferentiated presence of being. When we see abstractly, we see everything as one. Notice how the top of the boy's head is completely immersed in the background field, as is his torso. The clothing he is wearing dissolves his body into the background. It is because we recognize this face as a face that we understand that a whole body is present here. We transcend the appearance of things in the way we recognize the objects and figures we see as having their own discrete identity. We recognize that we are looking at figures and objects in space. Notice how this woven basket and fabric in the upper middle of the painting rhymes with the forms made by the woman's face and head covering. The forms are repeating themselves, and this also contributes to the motion of the painting. You see a receded form followed by a similar but more prominent form closer to the focal point, or the center of gravity, as I like to think of it. And this motion continues down her face, down the slope of her arm and shoulder, and around through the bowl and into the eggs. By understanding the objects and figures we see as abstract visual elements, we see them embedded in their environment. We notice how skin reflects the colors around it, the way everything appears the way it does according to the light it is illuminated under. When I say that seeing abstractly is seeing everything as one, I mean that when we see abstractly, we see everything in terms of light. Light is the medium under which all things unite in their visual appearance. Consciousness is the medium in which all things become unified in our awareness. Light is a lot like consciousness in this way. Everything we perceive is made of our consciousness. Before we recognize the discrete existence of any singular object as separated from the continuity of being, we first see it immersed in the wholeness of continuous light. We learn how to paint and draw as we learn how to see abstractly. And to see abstractly is to be as aware of negative space as one is of the positive space made by recognizable forms. By negative space, I mean the shapes that are made in between forms. Notice the shape that is made in between the arms, torso, and this dish. This space has a shape. The specificity of this single shape is the spatial relation between both of her arms and her torso. It explains the position of her body and the way her clothing rests on her body. I do not have to see her arms as arms. I do not have to trace each arm with my eye. All I must do is paint this single shape, and I make both arms recognizable. It is the negative space that provides the contour which places the subject as there in the world, in space. The negation explains how the items in the world are of the world. They complete the continuity of being. Seeing this way allows us to place all of the phenomena we experience on the same level. By focusing on the space outside of the arms, I find the arms. Similarly with perception, whenever I recognize anything for what it is because I have negated that which is not it. By examining perception, we reinforce our notion of being, which seems like a simple concept, yet it is difficult to grasp. The concept of being is difficult to grasp because it encompasses everything that is. And human beings make sense of the world by dividing and organizing everything into parts. The trained representational artist can observe the outside world as a continuous whole, a seamless presentation of light. By perceiving the world in this way, the artist can choose to emphasize whatever he or she is interested in. And to successfully do this, the artist must understand the phenomena they observe as abstract. The artist must suppress the recognition of the face as a face and must instead see lines, shapes, colors, and values. When we first read this painting, our immediate understanding of what is depicted has to do with the positive space made by recognizable forms. This is the straightforward figurative content of the painting. This is what is being represented in a simulated space. It is because we recognize what is depicted that we can untangle the overlapping shapes around the hands, the boundaries of each body, and this recognizability creates the implied boundaries of each form. When we recognize an abstract form as a representation of an object or figure, we are negating the space around that form as something else, as not that form. So negation is required to separate objects from the continuity of being, the oneness of being. Negation carves objects out of phenomenal consciousness. Non-being is needed to identify the discrete existence of things. Jean-Paul Sartre has a famous example in Being and Nothingness of meeting his hypothetical friend Pierre at the cafe. He first describes the activity of the cafe as a plenitude of being. That is to say that there are all of these things existing as positive elements. They are continuous in the sense that they all contribute to the general activity of the cafe. And he goes on into a description of people talking and smoking and eating and moving as a continuous plenitude of being. However, the expectation of meeting Pierre negates the activity of the cafe. All of the people and things existing in space become an undifferentiated ground from which a figure, specifically Pierre, may stand in relief against the ground. What Sartre is describing is the state of consciousness of looking or scanning for someone you expect to see. All the objects and faces that he scans while looking for Pierre announce themselves, only to quickly decompose in succession as he determines them to not be Pierre. The realization that Pierre is not here is an experience of non-being. Absence is an example of not being. Yet there is something substantive about it, and this is because being is primary to non-being, since something must exist in order for it to be negated. Now Sartre points out that should Pierre suddenly appear in the crowd, one's intuition would suddenly have this solid element, and the cafe would suddenly organize itself around him. Pierre's absence is perpetually renewing itself as he scans the crowd for him. He is constantly presented with his absence. His absence, his non-being, is a real event that happens at the cafe. Sartre writes that the ground is constantly slipping away, while it carries the figure in front of it in a perpetual disappearance. Sartre writes, "This figure, which slips constantly between my look and the solid, real objects of the cafe, is precisely a perpetual disappearance. It is Pierre raising himself as nothingness on the ground of the annihilation of the cafe. So that what is offered to intuition is a flickering of nothingness. It is the nothingness of the ground, the annihilation which summons and demands the appearance of the figure. And it is the figure, the nothingness, which slips as a nothing to the surface of the ground. It serves as a foundation for the judgment, Pierre is not here. The criteria we use to isolate and define objects from the continuity of being is based in nothing. Understanding a frying pan as a frying pan is to understand it in human terms. It is to understand it within human reality. And human reality, its narratives, its language, its goals, are all examples of nothing in the sense that they do not define things for what they are in themselves. When we define things in the world, we label them according to what they mean to us, and their meaning depends on our pursuits. You could examine any ordinary object as an example. A wooden spoon is differentiated from a stick only because it is used as a spoon. I could also use it as a back scratcher. None of these labels actually penetrate the object for what it is in itself, the noumena. Similarly, the skilled painter can see past what objects mean to human reality and instead see them for their abstract qualities. The shapes, lines, colors, and values all contribute and interrelate to form a spatial reality. These abstract qualities are understood on a universal level, meaning that they are not removed from each other. When we see the form of the woman's face abstractly, we see it just as we see the abstract form of the clothing, or the pan, or the negative space. We are seeing and understanding everything on the same level. We are focusing on being, the isness, the common factor of everything. The negation is an act of consciousness. We identify the boundaries of things based on their meaning. Their meaning derives from our individualized human reality. It derives from the situation we are in. Objects, things in and of the world, step forth into our awareness based on what we are in pursuit of in the moment we experience them.